Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're talking all about the real reason why landlords are selling. Now make sure you stay tuned to the very end of this video because we're going to be listing the various reasons why landlords are deciding to sell, or why some landlords are deciding to sell. And these range from, rational, logical decisions all the way through to emotional decisions that actually most of us make as investors. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Marco. I'm a portfolio landlord, property investor, developer and mentor, and I'm very passionate about helping people invest in property. So before I get into the main detail of this video, my wife and I are expecting our second child in only a couple of weeks. So I've got some really great videos that I'm going to be making over the course of this week, and hopefully when he arrives, and fingers crossed he's happy and healthy, I'll be taking a bit of time off, but you will still see videos being released on a weekly basis because I'm putting in a lot of effort now to get some really good videos filmed, edited and lined up for the remainder of this year. So why are some landlords selling now when I'm recording this video in 2023? Well, there are two main drivers. You have the landlords that are selling for rational and logical reasons, which we'll come on to at the latter half of this video. But first of all, we're going to be talking about the emotional needs and the emotional reasons why landlords are selling. Now, we all like to think of ourselves as savvy, rational, logical investors. I hate to break it to you, but we're not. We're human beings, and human beings make decisions based on emotion, not logic and not rationale. And here are three emotional reasons why we as human beings, and some landlords now, have decided to sell, call it a day. Maybe they're just selling 1, 2 or 3 of their properties and they're keeping some of their other properties and holding them for the foreseeable future. Now, the number one emotional reason really why some landlords are choosing to sell now is because if they can sell now, all of a sudden, they can get maybe £100,000, £200,000 in their bank account from selling one property, or maybe selling several properties. Now, of course, this is very tempting to do. It's very tempting to sell and to realize that money and maybe do something with it. But this is a real key reason why some landlords are choosing to sell. They've had a really good 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and now they're choosing to sell. They're going to sell their properties and they're going to get, some serious amounts of cash coming their way, coming to their bank account. Now, the reason why I'm classifying this as an emotional need and not so much a rational decision is because we all want to have more money in our bank account. Let's face it, who doesn't, right? And we feel maybe more at ease and we have more security if we have this. And especially, as from what I understand anyway, from speaking to investors that are double my age, the older you get, really, the more you start to think about this and the more you actually want those cash reserves in the account. Whereas when you're younger, you're not really too bothered about having your cash in the account. You're keen, you want to work hard, maybe you're willing to take a little bit more risk to make money in the future. Now, I've fallen victim to this particular emotional need, and I only have to go back to, I think it was 2021, where I sold the first ever property that I bought. Now, the reason why I sold this is because I came to the same decision-making process as these landlords have come to themselves, and they think, well, if I sell the property, I can walk away and I've got all this money in the bank account. But again, this is quite short-sighted. If you're coming up to retirement, maybe you can justify that and that's okay. But in my case, I certainly couldn't. In my case, I saw the money and I thought, wow, if I sell this, I can buy an aeroplane over here. Now, that in hindsight, that was the worst decision I've ever made, because for anyone that owns aeroplanes, you'll know they're liabilities, they're not assets. They end up costing you money. So don't be tempted to do what I did and sell a property just to get that money in the short term, unless you're really doing something meaningful with that property. So to summarize here, a lot of landlords are selling simply because they can sell and they can get a lot of money in their account, and of course that's very tempting. And why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you sell and you can generate hundreds of thousands of pounds in your bank account? Now, the second emotional reason why some landlords are selling is because of the stress. And I say stress in brackets because everyone deals with stress differently. Of course, stress is made up, it's all going on in your head. It's not really reality. And how you deal with stress, we can create a whole new video on that. And that's something that I'm no expert in. I'm sure you can find some other great people on YouTube that can tell you how to cope and manage and deal with stress. But let me share to you why some of these landlords are selling. So, cost of living has gone up, rents have gone up, and this has put a squeeze on some tenants. Some tenants can maybe now no longer afford to pay their rent. Now, some landlords therefore have trouble and difficulty getting in their rents, and of course this is going to cause stress. It would cause me stress, no matter how you take stress, but that would genuinely cause me stress if I were to struggle to get that rent payment in the account. So again, landlords are seeing this happen more frequently as the cost of living has increased, rents have increased. It puts a further strain on tenants' affordability. So again, an easy exit and an option to get out of this scenario is to sell, because if you sell, you're not going going to have that stress because you're no longer managing the property, you're no longer thinking about those rents. And that's just a nice and easy and a quick way, or a relatively quick way, to get rid of that problem. So a lot of this stress related issues, a lot of the property management related issues that cause stress is one reason why landlords are selling now. Yes, 5 years ago, rents were a lot lower and the ratio between, income to rents was far lower than what it is now. It's actually, I think it's over a third. So what this means is over a third of what a tenant earns in income is actually paid to the rent, whereas prior to 2023 it was less than this, and therefore tenants weren't under so much pressure to get their rent paid. And obviously this is spilling over to landlords, and they're maybe having slightly greater difficulty in managing property and getting the rents in, and therefore arguably having a more stressful time managing that property, and managing property seems less attractive to maybe other options. So that's one reason why landlords are selling. Now the third emotional reason why landlords are selling, and this is really, really important and probably one of the big drivers before we come on to the kind of the rational, logical reasons why landlords are selling, but this emotional need is because for those old school landlords, and when I say old school landlords, those that have been in the game a long time, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and the beginning of their journey, they could make very, very good returns. Now, as each decade has passed, they've started to see their returns diminish. Regulation has come in since, which makes being a landlord slightly less profitable, as we've got to do things to maintain the property on an annual basis, a 5-yearly basis. That obviously costs money. Of course, there are many more investors now in property than there were 30 years ago, which again diminishes the return. So all these landlords that have been in the game for 30 years, they're just looking at their return and they're thinking, well, it's just not what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And you know what? I'm just going to call it a day. Now, there are still some excellent and very amazing returns to be made in property, but we as humans, we like to see things in a relative manner. If you have gone to purchase 2 properties, for example, the first property you saw, in fact, you didn't really like it, but the second property, even though it was only marginally better than the first, actually you'd probably come away with a positive feeling about that second property. So again, if we use this example and we apply this logic and this theory to investing in property, it's kind of the reverse. As returns have diminished over the decades, it just makes property less attractive for those investors that have been in the market a long, long time. So if we group these 3 emotional needs together, it's really not difficult and it's really not hard to see why some landlords are selling. If they sell, they get a nice big paycheck. If they sell, they can get rid of their stress and their property management. And if they sell, well, actually, they're not thinking about their returns anymore. Yes, those returns have been slightly diminishing decade on decade, but they're not really thinking about that. They've had a really great 20, 30 years, and they can sell and they can get a nice fat lump sum in the bank account. Now, here's the thing, there's no right or wrong. Even though you've made an emotional decision to sell the properties, there's definitely not a wrong decision. It's whatever's right for you. And we as humans, we make decisions based on emotion. We like to think we make decisions rationally and logically, but we do not, and I can assure you we do not. I classify myself more on the rational, logical kind of spectrum in life, but even I make decisions based on an emotion, and it's very easy to see that once you make that decision and go back and think of the reasons why you actually made that decision. So enough over here on the emotional reasons why landlords are selling. Let's come on to the rationale and the logic behind why some landlords are choosing to sell. Now, first of all, the obvious one that we haven't really mentioned so far is landlords retiring. Well, if you want to retire and either quit work in its entirety or just scale it down and you're a portfolio landlord, well, of course, the answer is to sell property, or maybe to give property to an agent if you're managing it yourself. So again, lots of landlords are choosing to retire, and they're choosing to retire for several reasons. The emotional reasons we've already listed, and maybe the rational reasons that will come on to list very shortly. So retirement is, again, a really obvious example of why some landlords are choosing to sell their property. Now, number 2, the second reason why landlords are selling, and the rational reason, is some landlords are selling because of the proposed EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate changes that they probably won't, should come into effect from 2028. Now, in August, Michael Gove said that he was further delaying this process, so actually the proposal that this is coming in 2028 is going to be further delayed, and some investors think it's just not going to happen in any way, shape or form. This is not law yet, it's simply just a proposal, so this needs to be passed. So a lot of landlords, especially last year in 2022, were getting quite nervous about this, and they were looking at their properties, maybe properties that scored below the rating. So for those of you that aren't aware, the proposal is that for all buy-to-let rental properties that need to have a minimum of a C rating when it comes to their energy efficiency. Now, a C rating, C sounds quite poor, but actually C is a relatively good rating on this assessment. So think about it. You're a landlord, maybe your property is scoring an E or a D, and you have to spend, 4 figures really to get your property to be scoring a C. Now, a lot of landlords have old stock, old property. A lot of the stock in the UK is old and below a C. I think I read that at least 25% of buy-to-let properties are below a C. You know, it could be a Victorian property that obviously is 100 odd plus years old, and to actually get it to score to a C is quite difficult. Not only is it quite difficult, it's going to cost a lot of money. So landlords are selling because they're quite nervous and they're quite scared. If these rules do come into play, then they may have to spend 4 or 5 figures to get their property up to the required standard. Now, there are exemptions to this rule, and this rule puts a cap on how much you have to spend to increase your rating. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's £10,000. So you don't actually need to spend more than £10,000 to get your property to a C rating, but I could be wrong. Don't quote me on this, and this can change. So that's the reason why landlords are selling. You know, they're looking across their portfolio, they maybe have to spend £200,000 to upgrade to a C, and they're choosing to sell. Now, my personal opinion on this is, if it does happen, it's not going to be as bad as some people think it's going to be. I honestly can't see it being that bad. The majority of, a large percentage of housing stock in the UK doesn't meet a C, and to meet a C would need significant investment. So even if this happens, maybe there'll be grants to help landlords to do this, or maybe the exemptions will be slightly more generous. Now, the third reason, and a really obvious reason why landlords are choosing to sell now, is because of the recent interest rate rises. Now, if you haven't heard about the interest rate rise, I don't know where you've been, but since September 2022, interest rates have hiked considerably. Now, here's a funny thing. If you look at a 50-year average and take the UK 50-year average of the base rate, we're still actually below the 50-year average. So although, you and I think that interest rates are high, actually they're not if you look at on a 50-year term. However, we've just already discussed in a previous point that we as humans, we see things in a relative manner. So the past 15 years, it's been more or less zero. And now, all of a sudden, it's 5% plus. So if we're looking at this on a relative basis, of course, it seems really high and really expensive, but actually it's not. So landlords are selling because the increase in interest rate means that the mortgage cost is higher, and therefore, once their monthly profit, so they've got their rents in, they've paid the mortgage, they've paid the maintenance and other costs, that monthly figure they're left with is far less than what they were generating only a couple of years ago. So some landlords are deeming this not suitable, and therefore they're selling their property. So this means actually, if you're investing for income in property, it's slightly harder to invest in income than it was only a couple of years ago. Don't get me wrong, it's still feasible, it's just not as good as it was a couple of years ago. And again, because relatively speaking, it's not as good, this is why people choose to do something, and the something is to sell. So now we're kind of reverting to the old school way of investing in property, which is to invest in an asset that's going to appreciate in value over the long term. And this is why the majority of people invested in property prior to the 2007-2008 financial crash. So it's actually quite nice that we're taking a step back and we're not so focused on the short-term profits and the rental profits. We're actually taking a step back, looking at this investment from a long-term view and benefiting from the capital appreciation of this property over the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So we're approaching the end of the video. I'm just going to summarize the points, but also I'm going to leave you with what should you do next? How can you take advantage of this as a property investor wanting to buy right now? So let's summarize. So the reason why some landlords are selling now is because of the emotional drivers and also the logical decision making that goes behind that. So for example, landlords are selling because, first of all, if they sell, they can get a nice lump sum in their bank account. Second of all, they're selling so they no longer have to manage the property. They no longer have to have this, maybe the stress that's incurred around managing property and maybe rent arrears and things of that nature. But landlords are also selling, number three, because relatively speaking, over the decades, property isn't delivering that return that it once was. It's still delivering a great return, but it's not as high as it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. So number four, some landlords are choosing to retire. Number five, some landlords are worried about the proposed EPC changes that may come into place from 2028 and therefore are choosing to sell. And lastly, number six, some landlords again are choosing to sell because of the increase in the base rate, which means their profitability on their rental income once they've paid the mortgage is lower than what it used to be. And they're comparing what they're earning now to what they were earning maybe a couple of years ago and are choosing to sell. So there are 6 reasons why landlords are choosing to sell, but what can you do now as an investor to take advantage of those landlords that are choosing to exit and that are choosing to sell? Because if someone sells, normally there's something to be gained on the other side. Well, first of all, if a landlord is selling a tenanted property and they are adamant on selling the property tenanted and they don't want to serve notice to the tenant and sell it with what's called vacant possession, where it's empty as the name suggests, if they are selling a tenanted property, well, this could be a benefit to you as an investor, and here's the reason why. So if a landlord is selling a tenanted property, well, this is only going to appeal to really investors, because people that want to live in the property themselves cannot really envisage living in the property when a tenant is in there they're going to have to serve notice, they don't really want to get involved with doing that, they may be scared and just shy away from that task. So this only appeals to investors. Now we know that investors actually only occupy a very small percentage of the property market. Most buyers are those that want to live in the property themselves for their own home. What does this mean? Well, the landlord who's selling this property all of a sudden have decreased the number of people that could potentially buy this property. They've gone from 100% of the market, which is both investors, but more importantly, those looking to buy their own home, all the way down here to just investors. So this is great. And the reason why this is great is because there's less demand. And if there's less demand, well, what happens to price? Price will fall. So this means you as an investor could buy a tenanted property that's turnkey, it's already got a tenant in there at a discount. You have a much higher probability of getting a tenanted property at a discount than one that's vacant and would appeal to both those that want to live in the property themselves and to investors. So here's how you can profit and take advantage of those landlords that are choosing to sell. Now I know some really savvy investors that all they do, they just buy tenanted property and they target tenanted property. Anything that could really be open to people that want to live in the property themselves, they ignore, and they just focused on the tenanted investments, and they'll buy these investments at a really good discount. And I personally have had really good success doing this, again, simply because there's less demand, and because there's less demand, that landlord is getting less offers on their property. And maybe if you're the only person to offer on the property, well, guess what? You pretty much dictate the price. So that's a real good tip for anyone that's looking to buy now and actively looking to buy, in 2023, 2024, or whenever you're watching this video. Have a look at tenanted properties, consider targeting tenanted properties, and I think you're much more likely to get a really good deal. Are you one of these investors that are looking to make the most of this opportunity and invest in property? Now consider taking on a mentor who's been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. I really love helping people scale portfolios, growing from maybe 1, 2, 3 properties all the way to 10 or 20 plus, whatever your goal is. If this seems of interest, head to my website, www.ms7.uk. Click on the coaching and mentoring at the top, and you can scroll down to the bottom and you can book a call with me, and we can see if we're right to work with each other. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video and you now understand why some landlords are choosing to sell, but more importantly, you understand what you can do as an investor here today to turn that to your advantage. All the very best with your property investing week. Goodbye.